have been looking at the different kind of decision making processes for understanding the issues of operating organizations. To take the discussion forward, before we move on to the next component of the task, it may be a good idea to take a look at what some of the leading researchers and scholars, not to overlook the practitioners, have felt about the subject matter. STOHL and HOLMES discussed the misconceptions of the functional theorists. Basically, they had two objections. Decision quality is an objective characteristic or attribute that is apparent in the time of the production of a decision. Therefore, the functional theorists, to them, were making assumptions which were simply not valid. These two gentlemen were further of the opinion that relevant task communication takes place within meetings and not outside of the small group context. And finally, they were of the view that group action is non-simultaneous and meaningfully sequenced. If these two gentlemen are to have their way, these three concerns have to be built into the thinking of the functional theorists before they can be accepted. I would like you to be aware of this debate, and that is what the learning process at this stage is about. Accordingly, it was proposed by STOHL and HOLMES that two additional classes of functions be added to those developed by functional theorists. Because if you find that what somebody else has said is deficient, it stands to reason that you must suggest how it can be improved. And to improve it, it is important that according to STOHL and HOLMES, two additional efforts be made. One is that the action embeds the decision in the ongoing group life. This is the historical function. In other words, no decision making activity would be an autonomous variable. It would be embedded in some results of past action and some proposition which would make it essential for the decision maker to recognize what the system would accept or would not accept. It would accomplish the embedding of a decision in a permeable context, that is institutional functions. In other words, the decision being taken must be in systemic consistency and must be at peace with what the operational parameters of the organizations are. I would like to now move on quickly to a discussion on organization design and workflow. Some discussion has already taken place on design issues, and there is not going to be any need to review or restate them, because each lesson builds upon what the preceding lessons have achieved. But what this section of the presentation will seek to do is to link up organization design with workflow, which is an essential part of operating an organization, handling workflows. So, if you will recall, organization design involves the creation of roles, processes, formal reporting relationships in an organization. If organization design involves the creation of roles, processes and formal reporting relationship in an organization, then obviously it has significance for the workflow. The workflow itself cannot take place unless it passes through the roles, and the roles have to be defined in an operational sense, which raises the issue of job design, and we have discussed that. It can also be defined as development in or change to the structure of the organization. One can distinguish between two phases in an organization design flow: process as strategic groupings which establish the overall structure of the organization, its main subunits and their relationships, and operational design which defines the more detailed roles and processes. So, there are the strategic groups and there are the operational designs. The strategic groups have to do with creation of the subunits and their relationships, and operational design has to do with more detailed roles and processes. Because remember, this part of the discussion is on organizational design and workflows. So, workflows would require a mental model to understand that organization can have two groupings, one by strategy and other by operational design. This can be converted into a model or a framework for organization design aligning structures. So, what are the elements of the structures? As usual, we have environment, strategy, technology is being repeated, size, and people is being repeated. We have added to people, environment, technology two elements, size and strategy. As you notice, linking these 6 points of the pentagon is one thought. Organization design aligns structure with situational contingencies. That is a very important thought. I will pause here for a few moments to let that thought sink into you. Namely, the thought that organization design aligns structure with situational contingencies. What is it that is attempted to be said here? In operating an organization, one has to walk on two legs, or as it were move on two wheels. One is the permanence of structures, to the ephemeral character of a part of decision making which has to deal with situational contingencies. So, one has to combine the continuing stable component of operating an organization to the ephemeral and the passing component of an organization. A framework for organization design would involve aligning of structures. I would like to submit that this effort is an integral component of operating organizations. To focus more on the workflow system, I would like to walk you through some of the essential characteristics of a workflow, because after all, operating a system is a part of optimal functioning of the workflows. Workflow can be defined as the bridge between real world and the virtual world. If a play of words be permitted, in the world of organization management, the virtual world itself has a very high impact role. The real world often becomes the label for the material world which can be experienced not just cognitively, but materially it is impact making, say typically production conditions, inventory management, supply chain management, whereas virtual world will have to do with decision making styles. The real world contains the organization's structure, physical goods, employees and other organizations, and we have just explained it. The virtual world contains an organization's computerized infrastructure, including its application and databases. If the real world contains organization's structure, physical goods and employees, and the virtual world contains organization's computerized infrastructure, including its applications and databases, then marrying the two would require workflow which recognizes computerized facilitation or automation of business processes in whole or part, and that is an important tool in operating organizations. If that is workflow, that is the computerized facilitation or automation of a business process, then workflow management deals with a system that completely defines, manages and executes workflows through the execution of software whose order of execution is driven by computer representation of the workflow logic. Let us pause here to understand what is being suggested. A workflow management system is a system that completely defines, manages and executes workflows through the execution of software whose order of execution is driven by computer representation of the workflow logic, which means there is no material flow matching that workflow management system. Hence, operating an organization requires the understanding of workflows in a very subtle sense, but in a very operational sense. Workflow models represent the organization's design in a visible way. We have discussed design issues. Design issues are really issues of channelizing work, but you can't feel that design, you can't touch that design. And I am now taking forward what I have already explained to you earlier on. Organizations' design have a very real relationship with workflow models. Unlike organization design, job design, which cannot be felt or touched, workflow models have visible impact, have a situation or a positioning where you can almost be cognizant of work having passed a certain stage. If a discussion is on and 4 people are being involved in it, and a contract has to be drawn up, each of the 4 will make a contribution. Each of the 4 will help to move the contract forward. It may or may not be always committed to writing, but one thing which becomes increasingly clear is that work is moving. The level of sophistication of the thoughts, concretization of ideas, conversion of ideas into clauses, the refinement of those clauses are indicators of workflows. The workflow runtime interprets the workflow design. Now, this is very important. The workflow runtime defines the runtime. The combination of a model visibility and organizational execution tied to model facilitates both a top down and a bottom up evolution of organizations' computerized infrastructure. This is something which many systems people have not been able to grasp. That is, the software which an organization needs is to be modulated to the evolution of an organization's computerized processes, and therefore, the computerized infrastructure has to match the evolution. That subtle interface where the virtual world meets the real world will essentially define how an organization is operating. It is not unusual therefore, that where these levels of evolution of the virtual world have not been marked, computerization has brought in severe strains on decision making, and in many cases decision making is calibrated or affected to be in synergy with what the computerized system or model can handle. So, instead of computerization aiding the decision making processes are modulated to what computers can handle. That, to say the least, is an irony of the situation. The workflow models are also defined across organizational boundaries to facilitate trading between organizations, and therefore, it raises questions of intra-organizational relationships. No organization is an autonomous variable. No organization is a standalone organization. All organizations have a supply chain and have a distribution and a sales chain. Now, of course, there can be more players at either ends, but suffice it to say for the moment that workflow is also between organizations, and to understand workflow between organizations is central to grasping how do you operate organizations. Which brings us to the question of what is the nature of organizations. When I talk of nature of organizations in this context, I am talking of something more material and cognizable than what I was talking of when I was talking of understanding organizations. To get the discussion to serve the purpose for which it is directed, the nature of organizations can be rational, can be natural, can be open. Now, how do you distinguish one word from another? If the nature is rational in terms of the nature of the organization, it is collective oriented to pursuit of relatively specific goals and exhibiting relatively highly formalized social structures, that is business. It is to the pursuit of relatively specific goals exhibiting relatively highly formalized social structures. It is rational because it is pursuing business, its success or otherwise is determined by the kind of results of business growth and profitability which can achieve. A natural organization is a collective whose participants share a common interest in the survival of the system and who engage in collective activities informally structured to service this end. For example, a religion or a charity. Here, the end products are not that measurable. They are not seen in terms of profits, but the collective has a set of participants who engage in collective and families, collective activities for an objective which is somewhat abstruse and difficult to grapple. A coalition of shifting interest groups is an open system that develops goals by negotiation. The structure of the coalition, its activities and its outcomes are strongly influenced by environmental factors. One could think of political groups who come together to share power in a system, and who will walk out and walk in depending upon their calculation of what is going to work or what is not going to work. However that may be, it is important to recognize that there is a continuum of workflow systems. Workflow does never have a break. It is like the perennial stream. Messages are the means of communication between the organizational employees and between organization and its customers. One needs to recognize that the continuum of workflow has to do with an integrated throughput system which all organizations represent. Work items coordinate the receipt of the message with the organizational employees who carries out the work specified by the message. So, please recognize that operating organizations has a very significant component of passing instructions and the receipt of the message and the compliance. The organization has to communicate within the system. The organization also has to communicate outside the system. Be that as it may, it is significant that communication modes will vary depending upon the players who are in that system and the kind of messages which are to be conveyed, and the size of the message, the medium of the message, the parties to the message will decide upon the actual flow content of the method of communication. But that is how organizations operate. Work items coordinate the receipt of the message with the organizational employee who carries out the work specified by the message. Business rules automate the decision process used in assigning and executing a work item. There is a need to recognize that even business rules are a communication method. And finally, flow charts specify an organizational plan for how work flows through an organization. Operating an organization, therefore, is a complex process from planning to decision making to understanding workflows to recognizing that there has to be a continuum of messages, and all this to keep an organization functioning and at an optimal level at that. There are messages in a workflow because it deals with any type of message coming into the organization. Remember my reference to communication between organizations. If the messages coming into the organization are not decoded, then there may be a misfit between the linkage patterns, and therefore, there may be internal jerks and jolts within an organization. Once it enters the organization, it has to be routed to the correct employee for processing. So, a message travels from outside the organization to inside the organization. Once it reaches beyond the boundary of the organization, it is important that organization structure, processes, design enable that message to get to the correct employee, because if it does not get to the correct employee, then there will be all types of issues with reference to the job design, the role which was best equipped to handle that message, and hence the character of the workflow is a central determinant to operating organizations. It is my case that proactive and worthwhile organizations always monitor their workflow. They always have a requirement to make sure that there are no transmission losses in course of the workflow. No transmission loss of any variety can be acceptable if the organization cannot risk loss of opportunity or loss of effectiveness. In fact, the truth is annotations are added to a message as it is processed. In other words, messages also acquire a structure. To achieve all this, a workflow analysis is needed. A manager performs workflow analysis in order to examine how work creates or adds value to the ongoing process in a business. This again is an important concept. No workflow, however efficient, is worthwhile if as it flows there is no value being added to the concern that is being handled. Value being added means the quality of analysis being improved, the quality of solutions to improve that situation being improved, and above all the quality of choices being improved. So, one has to perform workflow analysis to make sure there is consistent and constant value addition at each level of the flow. It will be worthwhile to remind ourselves that a system can be very, very efficient, but it need not be equally effective. The relationship between efficiency and effectiveness is not necessarily that of congruence. Therefore, many work analysts at times lose the sight of the woods for the trees, because they are so busy improving systems efficiencies that the actual impact is almost out of focus. I would like to submit therefore that workflow analysis looks at how work moves from the customer, that is the demand source, through the organization to the point at which the work leaves the organization as a product or a service for the customer, again to meet the demand. So, the demand came from the customer, and the finished product or the service would leave the organization to satisfy the customer. Workflow analysis often reveals that some steps or jobs can be combined, simplified, and even eliminated. You will recall our discussion on job simplification by the simple act of bringing together certain cognate tasks at one desk. And yes, you are quite right, my reference is to the example of the post office. In another case, it results in reorganization of work, so that teams rather than individual workers are the source of value creation. I think this is an important point to remember. If we agree that in the ultimate analysis, it is not a person who is hired, but it is his skills which are being paid for, that it is not necessary that every individual should carry with himself a self-contained package of skills. He may need his skills to be supplemented by somebody else's skills to create the full package, because the unity which is being sought is not the unity of the person, but the unity of the activity. And there again, workflow analysis becomes critical and a significant part of moving organizations forward. Workflow analysis therefore is linked up with business process reengineering. Business process reengineering is different from restructuring in so much that it focuses not just on eliminating layers of management, but rather a fundamental rethink and a radical redesign of business processes to achieve dramatic improvement in cost, quality, service and speed. Yes, these 4 elements, cost, quality, service and speed, would bear repetition, because workflow analysis and business process reengineering are linked together, and analysis of workflow must lead to an improvement of the workflow analysis. How do we reduce costs, quality, improve service and reduce service losses, improve speed and cut down on time wastages? The method would be using workflow analysis to identify a company's core processes involved in producing its product or delivering its service to the customer. So, business process reengineering requires identifying a company's core process. Core process of a company is always a factor of the nature of the company. Is it a manufacturing company? Is it a servicing company? Is it a company which deals with a set of processes which are clearly identifiable and machine driven, or is it a company which deals with processes which are not necessarily machine driven, but very aggressively driven by logic, intangible factors, and yet having huge impact worth. The company organizing its human resources around these core processes will improve its organizational performance. We are again back to the socio-technical systems, where it needs to be understood that tasks are put together to create jobs. Jobs themselves may be around machines, may be around deliverables, they can be around any nucleus, but ultimately they require performance. Through this analysis, jobs are identified that can be eliminated or recombined to improve organization's performance. Therefore, be it workflow analysis, be it business process reengineering, the impact is again on the efficiency and effectiveness parameters, the thrust being as usual between the two on effectiveness. We are not going to get into the details of business process reengineering here, but since this is one of the ways in which it is possible to operate organizations, some attention is being paid here to the various components, and I will quickly list for you the various steps in business process reengineering, which has to do with steps in reengineering core processes, and they are identifying the core process, mapping core processes, evaluating all tasks for core processes, search for ways to eliminate unnecessary tasks or work, search for ways to eliminate delays or errors and misunderstandings, search for efficiencies in how work is shared and transferred among people and departments. These 7 elements are representative of steps in organizing organizations. They are steps in operating organizations. They are steps in making organizations effective and result prone. Operating organizations is really putting organizations to productive use, and for which various techniques are available. I have listed some, I am listing a few others, but I have also been at pains to keep you reminded of the fact that there are tangibles and intangibles, and above all workflow analysis is the king, of which business processes reengineering is another technique. And since it has been popular for quite a while with people, some time has been spent in helping you to understand how workflow analysis has business process reengineering as one of its techniques, what it has to do with operating organizations, and I would like to conclude this discussion by drawing your attention to the arguments of the proponents and some arguments of the critics. Yes, like everything else, there will be proponents, and like everything else, there will be critics. Proponents say that it allows reinventing of a company by making it lean and mean. This was a slogan which went the rounds several times about 10 years ago. Give me a lean and a mean organization. Today, the model has somewhat changed and people are willing to go for lean organizations. I do not think people are very keen to put up with mean organizations. The organizations today are supposed to have a human face. Then we have the critics of the system. Hammer of Champion Hammer actually says, do not automate, obliterate. To many critics, reengineering's greatest weakness is its lack of human side or its depersonalization. But then the critics of the critics point out that business process reengineering was never meant to be the answer to all problems. It was a logical extension of the scientific method of management which Frederick Taylor had talked about. And in business process reengineering, efficiencies were ranked very high, and the assumption very often used to be that if you have efficiencies, effectiveness will follow. I would like to conclude by the statement of what would appear the useful way of rounding off this discussion. And the useful way to my mind of rounding off this discussion is work involves people. People are therefore integral to work. Effectiveness of machines requires effectiveness of people. Effectiveness of people requires continuous upgradation of skills and taking care of them. Put together, the man machine system will only be effective if the operating principles of the organization require and marshal tools and techniques which take care of them both.